Is America's relationship with Saudi Arabia in trouble? Reports claim Riyadh has refused the Pentagon's offer of combat ships to modernise its fleet in the Persian Gulf. Is this because of cooling relations with Washington, or because the kingdom's economy is suffering from falling oil prices and the high cost of its long-lasting aggression against neighbouring Yemen?
A former US diplomat said the declining relationship began well before Obama came to power, and added the US-Saudi relationship has always been about self-interest, not values. The low oil price has also caused a major budget deficit and financial burdens as the Saudi Arabian population continues to grow. Some believe this is a significant reason behind Riyadh's resistance to purchasing US warships.
What factors have damaged Saudi-American relations? What is the impact of American admissions of self-interest on its dealings with Riyadh? And how serious is the Saudi Arabian economic crisis? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, Saudi Arabia has reportedly declined the US's offer of new warships. What signal does this send about the relationship between the two regimes? We asked the American public.
I don't know what that signifies. I don't know why they did that.
I think it shows an attempt by Saudi Arabia to get a little bit more power in the region, particularly in response to what's, I think what they view as an increase in power in Iran, as well as destability due to Syria.
Well, it doesn't seem like they like each other very much.
I'm not sure. I would say probably that the U.S. figures that the Saudi government does not need any additional assistance at this time.
I don't know any reason to that, and is there really deterioration? Possibly. Difficult to say. I think there is a strong relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US, though.
Can our experts interpret the signal Saudi Arabia sends by refusing America's offer of new warships?
Well, it's interesting. I guess the Saudi regime is really, it's just carrying on with its insane policies, which the United States has been supporting on every level, including the last arms deal, which was $60 billion. So it's kind of interesting how this vassal state, which enforces American policy and literally funds the terrorism going on in the region, specifically ISIS, and this is a known fact, this is a matter of public record. The United States wants to continue arming this nation despite the fact that it supports terrorism, and this very nation is refusing it. It's a bit humorous on some levels. It seems as if the United States, and Britain as well, have no compunction whatsoever with providing the worst kinds of weapons, weapons of mass destruction, the same weapons of mass destruction we went and invaded and occupied Iraq over. We have no problem apparently delivering these things, the worst things of all kind, really weapons of mass destruction to Saudi Arabia. And it looks like, it's inevitable that this whole relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is doomed to fail eventually. I don't think the petrodollar system will probably make it out of 2016, 2017 intact. I find it hard to believe that system will remain. That system is very much at the heart of all the problems we see in the world. So, the sooner it goes, the better, quite frankly.
I think this is a bit of a tricky question because it does not really say anything about the relationship between the two countries, more than it says about the fact that the deal was not really acceptable for Saudi Arabia. So what it says to me is that, they did not like the amount of money they had to pay for those warships. They did not like the fact that it would take 7 years to actually complete their construction. So I think we should be very careful here not to make any sort of generalizations about the entire relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, especially since the Saudi Arabia or the Saudis actually really need those warships. They are in desperate need to modernize their navy, and especially since the tensions are building up right now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, they would be more eager to get their hands on those ships than any other time. So I think it's just the technicalities.
Even former US Ambassador to Riyadh, Charles Freeman Jr, has admitted a long deterioration in the US-Saudi relationship, beginning from well before the Obama administration. What's caused this? We invited the public to speculate.
I don't know. I think there's always been like a very hostile relationship between the two nations, which I think is something definitely that we should try to fix.
Saudi Arabia partially being supportive of terrorist organizations on the Sunni side, and we don't need their oil as much as we used to.
I think it's just two powers looking for hegemony over mostly a resource, the oil resource. And that's about all I can say. I don't really know other than that.
It's probably the differences in the type of government that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. has.
I think the change in the leadership in Saudi Arabia, possibly coupled with their war with Yemen.
What is the real underlying cause of the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Riyadh? Is there a clear cause? And if so, can our experts explain what it is?
Well, it appears as if the relationship is becoming more and more problematic, because the truth, which has always been there for those of us who are paying attention, is that Saudi Arabia has been and continues to be the primary funder of terrorism in the region. Again, this is a matter of public record, and that anybody would seriously debate this really questions their intelligence or their motives. The United States and Saudi Arabia have had a grotesque relationship for a long time now. Of course, we know that women have no rights in Saudi Arabia, and yet we never hear the United States talk about the poor women who have no rights, who can't go out in public on their own, can't drive a car, don't vote, have no say, and can be raped and otherwise abused by men, and there's really nothing they can do about it. We have no problem with that and have continued that relationship, but it's becoming more and more known to the public. And this is a very difficult thing to explain now, isn't it? You know, that we are actually saying we're fighting for people's rights and democracy and all this sort of stuff, and yet the most grotesque nation on the planet, probably indisputably Saudi Arabia, the only nation in the world named after a family, this grotesque nation with no real rights that's just mass executing people, including the sheikh that we saw recently. You know, this is insane, and more people are realizing it, and I think it's becoming more problematic.
If we follow the events, the line of events that happened after the Iraqi war, in 2003, I think, in my opinion at least, I think the cause of this was the fact that after the first parliament, or when the first Iraqi government was elected, the elections brought to power a Shiite government, al-Maliki's government, and Saudi Arabia did not support that government because they thought it was an ally of Iran, and given the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, that was a cause of a deterioration in the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi. And the U.S., on the other hand, was trying to avoid the same mistake they did in Palestine when the elections brought to power Hamas, and then Hamas was boycotted from, the European Union, from the U.S., and even from Arabic states. So they were trying to avoid running into the same problem. And they were walking a very thin line, since the relationship between Iran and the U.S. itself is not the most perfect of kind of relationships. But still, they supported al-Maliki's government. They were hoping that Saudi Arabia would do the same, but Saudi Arabia was viewing that with hesitation. And that's the same kind of situation that's happening in Yemen, because a lot of observers and academics would see what's happening in Yemen as a proxy war, the same kind of war that was fought between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, when they would fight proxy wars as opposed to fighting each other directly. So the Houthis are believed to be allies of Iran, and Saudi Arabia is bent on taking them down.
The former US ambassador admitted that US-Saudi relationships are based entirely on self-interest, not values. How damaging, in the public's view, is this admission for the US, given its claim to hold the moral high ground on values?
I am very moralistic. I raised my children to be that way, and I think, once again, it's a bias. It's a very negative bias. Untrue.
I don't know that that's a particular damaging admission. That's an attempt to be real in the real world.
Probably pretty damaging, because if the values aren't good, then that means that we're not very good either.
I don't think it's damaging at all for the U.S.
Well, not very nervous. I think energy will play a major role, for decades forward. And what we see right now is just it.
But are these admissions of American self-interest truly damaging in any practical sense for America and its relationship with, for example, Saudi Arabia? Our experts offered their opinion.
The first thing I would say to that is that I don't know why anybody would give any moral authority to any of the Western nations, much less the United States. The hypocrisy does not even begin to describe what the United States is about. It's way beyond hypocrisy. There is no moral authority at all. All we see is consistent war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the United States, and also a policy of propping up the most brutal of dictators or tyrants as long as they carry out U.S. policy. Let us not forget that Saddam Hussein was our best friend and ally when he was killing Iranians and torturing Shia and gassing the Kurds. We knew all this. We continued that relationship. We continue to have the same kind of relationship with the Saudi regime. So whenever it's advantageous, or at least perceived to be advantageous for the bankers who run the U.S. government, we'll get into bed with anyone. And we have done, and we'll continue to do so, because there is no moral authority. The United States has been morally bankrupt for so long that I really don't even know why anybody would seriously entertain anything they say that seems to be noble. There is nothing noble about U.S. policy. I mean, literally nothing to point to. So if the United States says anything, I just don't even know why anybody pays any attention to it. If anything, we should simply be calling them out on their hypocrisy and pointing out the sheer insanity of all they say.
I think it does not really imply anything or is not really damaging to the U.S. at all, because the debate between values and interests is a huge debate in international relations and international affairs and studies related to international affairs. So what it does say more than anything is that the ambassador or the former ambassador is more than anything a realist. And realists tend to believe that everything in the world is based on interest. And I mean, it's not really a secret that there is not much of a value-based alliance between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. If we were to talk about values, Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Sunni world, or strives to be the leader of the Sunni world. The U.S. is trying to be the beacon of democracy and Christian values, being, the torch of lightness to the world and whatnot. So there is a huge difference there between the values of the two. And the fact that after 9/11 their relationship was still intact is because they share a lot of interests. Saudi Arabia wants to rely on the U.S. for all sorts of defense purposes. And the U.S. is very interested in the oil resources of Saudi Arabia and the fact that Saudi Arabia occupies a very central region in the Middle East. So it's a very strategic, interest-based alliance to begin with.
Now the US has surpassed Saudi Arabia as the world's largest energy producer, how nervous should Saudi Arabia be about its continuing economic crisis? We asked the public.
No, I think that things are going to be better, and I don't believe that they need to be nervous. They are high producers of the substance as well, so I don't think that there is any need for alarm.
I'm sure Saudi Arabia is recognizing that they're not going to, in the long run, be quite as important as they have been, but the world's going to need petrochemicals for a long, long time.
I think instead of being very nervous, you just look at the first step you got to do, just like America does. A lot of places right now are in economic troubles. Anything in life, you just find the first thing you do, focus on that, then you go to the second, then you go to the third, and then it'll be cured. But if you just look at it as a whole, it's overwhelming and nothing will ever change.
Worried if it's a crisis. That's pretty bad. Nervous a lot. They should probably find some ways to fix that.
It should be very nervous. Well, I know with the decline in oil prices and the changes that's going on in their society, they face some difficulties ahead.
To what extent do our experts feel that Saudi Arabia should be concerned about its continuing economic difficulties in the light of America's increasing power in the energy market?
Saudi Arabia should be extremely nervous. They're living on borrowed time. The truth is the most powerful weapon of all, and for years and years and years, Saudi Arabia has been protected by our mainstream media. You know, think about it. If we wanted to expose Saudi Arabia, they could have been exposed so long ago is the biggest monstrosity. I mean, we talk about the Taliban. How is the Taliban worse than the Saudi regime? In so many respects, the Saudi regime is far, far worse, especially when you look at the financing of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, and all this sort of stuff. So how is it possible that Saudi Arabia has managed to operate this way for so long? Well, because the bankers and the mass media in the West and the governments, who are all corrupted, have provided protection to them. And we've also been selling them weapons as well. So again, I simply repeat that the moral bankruptcy of the West is such that we can hardly take anything they say seriously. Saudi Arabia is also threatened by the fact that there is technology that exists today that really goes beyond any need for petroleum. Free energy exists. Nikola Tesla had proved this over 100 years ago. So oil, which is something that we've been compelled to use by our so-called leaders, is actually an antiquated energy production means. We don't need it. And so even on that level, Saudi Arabia is living on borrowed time. But even more dangerous for them is the end of the petrodollar system. And when that ends, not only is Saudi Arabia going to be going from riches to rags, rather, but America also, and its fake, fraudulent economy, which has given a prosperity that's undeserved to the American people, that's all going to wither away as well. So both Saudi Arabia and America have a tremendous amount to be concerned about. As far as I'm concerned, they're living on borrowed time.
What Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, should be very nervous about, and is really nervous about, is the lifting of the sanctions on Iran. Just in the last couple of days after, or just since the sanctions were lifted just yesterday, basically 27 billion pounds worth of, 27 billion pounds of value in the stock markets of the Middle East have been wiped out. And that's not to mention the effects of the sanctions on the price of oil. If you've been following what's been happening in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has been leading basically some sort of alliance against ISIS, the Arab alliance against ISIS, and part of the weapons they've been using against ISIS is to reduce the price of oil, so that ISIS in Iraq and Syria does not have that much of revenue from the fact that they are basically in control of a very high percentage of oil resources in those two countries. So now with Iran entering the oil market again, and some experts would say that they are going to start producing up to 500,000 barrels of oil a day, that is going to reduce the price of oil even more. And Saudi Arabia is right now having a very serious economic crisis, let alone because of the fact that their major source of income, oil revenues, have been reduced because of the reduction in oil prices and increasing the supply, and also because of 9 months of war on Houthis in Yemen.
CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate says the US has lost credibility in the region in recent years, and the Saudis are now listening to the US less than before. What has been the US's biggest blunder in the region? Here's the public's view.
I think possibly the way they've handled the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and currently some of the decisions regarding Syria and some of the Syrian dissidents.
I have no idea.
I think it was a mistake to invade Iraq. I don't think we had national interests at stake that were significant enough for us to commit those resources and those lives to that war.
Listening to the Republicans.
What, in the opinion of our experts, has been America's biggest blunder in the Middle East, and with the Saudis in particular? Here's what they said.
The biggest blunder for the United States in the region. Well, I think, first off, let us reframe the question. Are the policies of the United States a failure? If you ask me, no, they're not, actually. They're very consistent with policy papers laid out by the Project for a New American Century, and in particular, Odi Dinan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. If you look at those papers and the agenda laid out in both of those documents, actually the policy is intended to favor Israel and what's known as the Greater Israel Project. So the whole point of the policy in the Middle East, especially those nations surrounding Israel, is in fact to break them up, to sow the seeds of sectarian hatred, to basically to feed violence so that the Arab and Muslim population will, quote, bleed each other. Chaos and division, and in that weak and fractured state, a sort of balkanization of the surrounding states of Israel, the plan is in the long term for Israel to expand. American sons and daughters have been used in this agenda, and they're killing themselves to the tune of about 22 a day, committing suicide. Americans have been used to fight Israeli wars. The policy in the Middle East is not actually a failure. It's actually what the actual policy is to do what we've done. So if you want to say that American policy is based on what we're being told, and you believe that, then, well, yes, there's any number of failures. Iraq is a basket case. Syria is a basket case. The region is on fire. We've got failed states in Libya. Syria, thankfully, is holding on, but we're looking at the Kurdish region. I mean, the whole place is an absolute disaster, unless, of course, the real policy is to create chaos so that eventually the weak and fractured Arab states can be taken over effectively by an expansion of Israel. So I think we make a mistake in the way we present the question. I think the question is wrong. We need to stop accepting what the policy statements are by the State Department and looking at what is actually transpiring. And what is actually transpiring could only be considered an active attempt to sow the seeds of chaos throughout the Middle East.
The biggest blunder in the region has been the Middle East peace process. The Middle East peace process started, after the Madrid Peace Conference in 1990, 1991, early 1990s, and the Oslo Accords were signed 1993, 1995, and there was supposed to be a Palestinian state delivered after 5 years, or by the year 2000. And those talks were basically they were sponsored by the U.S. The U.S. was the mediator, but it was a biased mediator. It was too involved to be an honest broker of the peace process. So basically, the peace process started on the premises that 5 years down the line there will be a Palestinian state established, and until today there has been no Palestinian state established at all. What has happened is that the rate of settlement expansion on Palestinian land has increased by more than 70%. And you can see that this was one of the main touch points or the main problematic points in the US-Saudi relationship as well, when Prince Turki Faisal issued or wrote an op-ed piece. I think it was in the New York Times when the Palestinians were applying for membership in the United Nations, and the issue was being debated at the UN Security Council, and Prince Turki Faisal basically said if the US vetoes that, it would lose its main ally in the region, which is Saudi Arabia, who has been advocating the Arab peace plan of 2003 on the premises that there will be a two-state resolution when Israel withdraws back to the 1967 borders. Besides that, the obvious blunder has been the war in Iraq.
For decades, the United States needed Saudi oil. Now, thanks to shale oil, the US has surpassed Saudi Arabia as the world's largest energy producer. Saudi Arabia's growing international isolation and increasing domestic instability have added to the US-Saudi divisions. With no ship sales to Saudi, America won't even be able to offset some of its own procurement costs. These cooling relations mean that damage to both regimes, politically, economically, and strategically, now looks inevitable.